Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for celebrating 50 years of European policy scholarship, foreign policy scholarship. So I guess we all have our own favorite picks in terms of what we would see as the most important piece of work for us in terms of our scholarship, in terms of influencing our thinking, perhaps encouraging us to think about European foreign policy in a completely different way, or something that you think is an underappreciated classic, something that hasn't got the attention that it deserves in the course of scholarship that we've had on the study of Europe and of the study of European Union foreign policy. And what we're going to do here in this session is to give 5 participants a chance to set out a piece that's important for them and provide us with reasons for why maybe we should read it, or why they think it's had a personal impact. Now, finally, we'll turn to Ian Manners from the University of Copenhagen. So the same drill, Ian will introduce the piece and then we'll open up for questions or for comments. Ian, over to you.
Great, thank you, Richard, and thank you to all the other presenters. I must say I very much enjoyed looking at and reading the articles, particularly Olivia's pieces. I did take the time to look at some of her more theoretical pieces, and I found them extremely interesting. I would encourage everyone to read more broadly into some of the readings set out for today's session. What I want to do in my 5 minutes is talk about a book by a scholar called Catherine Guisan, possibly the book on EU foreign policy you've never heard of. And in particular, I want to set out why I chose this book, what it has to say to us, and what it's talking about. So to do this, I want to firstly talk about why I chose this book. When I was asked to present a classic on foreign policy or a European foreign policy, I couldn't think of any. That's not because there aren't any. It's just that I can't think of any one book that's shaped my thinking in this area. Instead, I reflected a little bit on those books that had over time shaped my sort of intellectual thinking, autobiographical, I suppose. Of course, immediately, growing up in Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s, I thought of Stuart Hall's works. And then traveling in the later 1980s and seeing the systematic destruction of the global ecology, I thought of James Lovelock's work. But over time, particularly as a student in the United States, I encountered the work of Hannah Arendt, a vast collection of different works, somewhat idiosyncratic, which makes them difficult to talk about and difficult to think about in terms of European foreign policy. So in the end, I chose a book by Catherine Guisan called A Political Theory of Identity in European Integration. And the reason I chose this book is it is, in fact, an Arendtian piece on how to think through European integration and European foreign policy in terms of political theory. Indeed, it's probably, for me, become one of the most interesting and perhaps important books on European foreign policy that no one's ever read. It's quite novel in the sense that it doesn't just use the work of Hannah Arendt, but draws on the work of, for instance, Paul Ricoeur, Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, and did so long before anyone in EU studies was reading these books. I should say the book is actually her 2000 PhD from the University of Minnesota, which was updated into French for a 2003 French language production, which was then updated in 2012 into the English language. So it's a work that has grown over time. What it does that's interesting, I think, is it anchors itself in political theory. It talks about European integration in those terms. And then it thinks about what we can learn from this in the study of EU foreign policy. Now, for anyone I'm sure like you and me that have tried to explain European Union foreign policy, one of the most difficult questions is, what is it for? Who is it for? Maxine set out at the top of the session that European or national foreign policy is for the state. But then who is European foreign policy for? And this has always been a question which has worried me, particularly in the context of studying and advocating the study of normative theory, something that wasn't done when Richard and I first started studying EU foreign policy. Just to summarize the book really quickly, it sets out a number of principles that it uncovers through a hermeneutic approach. That's an interpretive approach based on using interview methods to ask questions of people that have been involved in European integration or have been witnessing European integration over the period 1950 to, let's say, 2012. And it sets out three specific principles which are of interest to us. First is the idea that European integration is fueled by the memories and beliefs along the lines of the principle of reconciliation. But what is interesting in the book is she extends this to the study of acts of reconciliation, the Franco-German act of reconciliation, reconciliation in Central Europe between Greece and Turkey, and then in a chapter on foreign policy between Kosovo and Serbia, of course, an act of reconciliation still in process. The second principle that she studies and thinks about is the principle of power as action in concert, an idea I'm sure that you're familiar comes directly from the works of Hannah Arendt, and studies CFSP as a power of action in concert. And for my thinking over the last 20 years, this is inordinately important. People ask me, what does normative power mean? Well, it's the power to shape the normal. What does that mean? Isn't that simply hegemony? Well, it depends on whether you think power is for yourself and yourself alone. And the action in concert, of course, breaks that kind of rationalist thinking that power is always for you at the expense of others. The third principle she sets out in the book is the principle of the recognition of the other, in particular the study of EU relations with Turkey and acts of recognizing the other. Why do I think this book is interesting in studying EU foreign policy? For one thing, if you read these principles the other way around, you get actually a type of a logic of what is EU foreign policy for? To bring about recognition with others, to try and change and shape the world with others, and to bring about reconciliation, as Toni has just set out, in the context of long-standing 200 to 500-year-old patterns of imperialism and colonialism. In conclusion, one of the comments I would make is that reading Hannah Arendt and reading Catherine Guisan's work based on Hannah Arendt reveals some interesting stories that I think sometimes we need to think about. Arendt was acutely aware in the 1940s of the processes of European integration that were taking place then, and wrote a number of pieces warning of what could go badly wrong if European integration wasn't done right. In particular, the extent to which the EU ran the risk of not addressing anti-Semitism, racism, or imperialism, and simply reproducing larger structures in the mirror of the chauvinism of European colonies and empires as they were, German, Italian, and French. And I think for me today, this acts as a reminder of why we study the EU, why EU foreign policy is interesting, and what we need to think about when we try to make sense of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. You're also accompanied by birdsong that you probably couldn't hear.
Yeah, that's my audience.
Very soothing. I think that as a choice, it's an interesting one. Both, I think, in terms of the demands it makes to the readers, because I think it's a demanding book, and probably, I think it'd be fair to say, only the most advanced student could take on the book. But I was also interested in why it appealed to you initially, and in particular, you were started off, I think it's fair to say, by being interested in sort of beliefs behind symbolism, and whether that's one of the reasons why the book struck a chord with you. Yeah, very much so. My original PhD work in the 1990s was on trying to make sense of the symbolism and substance of European integration, for which, of course, people like Stuart Hall and his work on cultural practices, and Pierre Bourdieu's work on practices as well were interesting. But one of the things that Catherine's work does is
it explains how she does her research, and it walks you through how the interaction of political theory, and as you say, a political theory that's not always easily accessible, and how she puts this together in her examination of memory, speeches and acts. And it is a study of words and deeds. So in that respect, it breaks the sort of somewhat artificial dichotomy that's grown over the past 30 years between discourse analysis and practice study. Why I think I engage with her is it helped me make sense of Arendt in a way that I couldn't see myself. And so in that respect, it's extremely useful, I think, for students that are studying political theory or international political theory and sometimes have trouble putting it together with the study, analysis and understanding of the EU. I think Toni's comments before about trying to put together the study of, let's say, colonialism and post-colonialism with the study of the EU is difficult because people don't do that or haven't done that in the past, and it's not always easy to make sense of these two sides, let's say, of the study of the EU.
And can I pick up on the point about method? Because I think, you know, what's also interesting about the book is the method. And certainly for me, you know, that is quite a powerful takeaway. Do you want to say a little bit, for people who may be unfamiliar with the book, about, you know, the method that underpins the analysis?
Yeah, I mean, Catherine did something which is, in some respects, no longer possible, in that during her PhD, she either interviewed or had interview access to a large number of participants in the processes of European integration. And then subsequently, when updating the book, in particular to embrace the study of European foreign policy, spoke with participants and tried to get a sense with, in particular, the agonistic component of those that were engaged on both sides of the debate in the enactment of European foreign policy. So it is really an uncovering of foreign policy through talking to and trying to make sense of the words of deeds of those who were participating in it. In this respect, it is kind of classical hermeneutics in the sense that you've got to there's an attempt to try and understand and make sense of the participants within the context in which they act.
That's really interesting, and there's a bit of a connection here, I think, with a question that's come through on the chat that I'll get to in a moment. But before I do that, I wanted to encourage everybody who was online to share what would be their must-read classic. If you don't mind, so you can share it with everybody in the chat. You don't need the full citation. Nobody's going to get low marks for not giving us the page numbers, but it'd be interesting to hear from people out there as to what you'd put forward. The question, Ian, from Baris Selik is, I wonder what Professor Manners would have to say about the degree of engagement with political theory in case studies on European foreign policy. To give an example, some scholars engage with Habermas's theory of communicative action more as a theory of deliberation than as critical theory. Can we say that political theory is sometimes used rather selectively in European foreign policy?
Yeah.
More than a yes/no answer would be good.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a PhD student, I've been there and I've done that, which is that if you're in the Department of Political Science or Politics, certainly in the Anglophone world, generally political theory is seen as a tool to make sense of your case studies. And I've been there and I've done that. And I found myself towards the end of my PhD snipping out the political theorists that I knew would antagonize the examiners. And I think it's a tragedy. But it is a problem today. I teach with some of the books that others have referred to in their presentations and some of the articles. And it's extremely difficult to try and get people to, one hand, think about, right, if we talk about international normative theory and we talk about the European Union and what's it for and what its foreign policy does, how can you apply this to case studies where nobody is really, or very few scholars are thinking through this type of connection, or they don't have space within the article to do so. One of the reasons I chose Catherine's book is it allows you to do that. I noticed from Baris's question, he referred to Habermas, for instance, and Catherine uses Habermas. But, you know, of course, Habermas in this sense was working from and out of a specific, somewhat strange interpretation of Arendt's work. And I think the way in which Catherine uses Habermas to try and make sense of thinking and speaking out loud is probably a more useful way of thinking about it. But there is a terrible problem, I think, of assuming, as you see in too many, I think, IR theory textbooks, that Habermas equals critical theory. So when I talk about critical social theory, I tend not to do Habermas because I think it's so problematic in that respect for a variety of reasons. So yeah, I mean, it is a very real challenge. And in the absence of good textbooks that do this, it is actually quite difficult to do this with even, in my case, master's students taking a course on, you know, the EU as a global actor, for example.
Comment.
Yeah, I mean, it was related to that question. When I introduced some of the readings, I suggested that Stuart Hall's work had been important in trying to make sense of the symbolism of European practices. But it's not simply the symbolism. His work talks about cultural representations. How do we know what we know? And he was writing within the context of neoliberalism and questions of racial identity in the 1970s and the 1980s. But it does become extremely useful format and framework, particularly his representation and reception theories, to understand how the notion of what is foreign policy and what isn't, and what is good foreign policy and what is bad foreign policy gets represented to us in everyday media. You know, the question of Brexit in that respect is you know, an absolute classic, where everything is a representation and everything needs reception theory to make sense of it. But it's doubly important when we study the EU and what's going on with the climate emergency. It's very difficult to break out of our existing cultural practices because they're written for us. And so you know, I would always advocate, and somebody asked a question online, you know, how can we incorporate these kind of approaches? Well, I actually get the students to read reception theory in almost all the classes that I teach, whether it's political cinema or EU foreign policy.
Unbelievably, we've run out of time. You know, talking about reading, if I could put it that way, would not be something where we could sustain a conversation. But I've got a page full of questions here that I can bug you about individually in the future. But I wanted to thank all of you for sharing, also for those who have shared on the chat, because there are also some alternative suggestions there. And Emily at UACs has been kind enough to say that she would collate readings for anybody else who wanted to share their pieces that they would encourage people to read. And I think this is sort of start of a conversation rather than the end of one. So I hope we can do some more, hopefully not in lockdown, but actually face to face. And let me thank our sharers, if I can call them that, Maxine, Paula, Nele, Toni and Ian, you know, for both selecting, which I think is a tough thing to have to do, and then being willing to talk about what their choices were and why. I mean, I found it really interesting and a great opportunity to reflect upon what's important in terms of my own reading. So I hope everybody will take that away as well. Stick with this channel, I would say. Thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you for all of you who attended virtually. And I look forward to engaging with you all again in similar events. So thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.